What makes a king a king? Once he seizes power, whether by conquest or consensus, how does he hold on to it? And how does a king create an ideology that legitimizes his rule? These are all questions that go to the heart of much of the art of the ancient world. We've seen that once populations grew, religions became more complex. An elite class of people controlled the rest of the population. It was necessary to develop an ideology justifying their power and to have social cohesion of the population. Art has a lot to do with creating this ideology. What we see is that if you're a ruler, you need to have a rationale for your authority. Why? To get people to give up resources, pay taxes, or otherwise submit to the power of a government, they have to believe that they're doing it for a good reason, like the government has to offer them protection or support, preferably both. To that power and support can be real, or it can be an illusion. Being a divine king, a majestic and heroic conqueror, is a much better rationale for rule than most. Art can create or perpetuate that illusion or reality of power and divinity. We saw earlier that in Mesopotamia, when cities first arose, images of priest kings feeding boughs of plants to flock animals were common. They implied in a visual sense that the priest king would provide for his people. He was responsible for ensuring the fertility of the land. Once states emerged, leaders had both ritual and practical responsibilities. There was an implied agreement between leaders and their people that the job of most kings was to intercede with the gods to make sure there was abundant sustenance for their people. There was another important rationale and role for kingship, too, that included leadership in warfare. Kings provided protection from enemies and evil forces. This involved actual conquest of potential threats. In Mesopotamia, images of conquering kings vividly portrayed the king treading upon his enemies. In the Akkadian stela of Narmer of about 2254 to 2218 BC, Narmer is not only marching in triumph upon the naked dead enemy, he's a divine figure, and vigorous and muscular as such a hero should be. In this vivid royal image, the king is portrayed as super powerful, larger than life, heroic and victorious in war. He takes care of his people. He defends them from the enemy, conquers more territory, and puts order into the world. He allays the anxiety of his people. This notion of kingship seems to be almost universal. Whether a king was warlike or not certainly varied, but his hold on power depended on his ability to demonstrate strength. And there was no culture as good at and as consistent in providing the art and ideology for the underpinnings of kingship as Egypt. Here we have one of the first masterpieces created in Egypt, and indeed in the world. It's a stone carving, what we call a palette. There's a masterful and very sophisticated approach to both the content and the style of presentation here. This object glorifies the king and sets a precedent for how Egyptians will show his figure in art. What we're looking at is one of the first historic documents in the world, according to some Egyptologists, like Bob Breyer in his wonderful course for the Great Courses. This piece is actually a sort of document or manifesto that can be read with closer scrutiny, but it doesn't have to be specific to be just as effective as propaganda. It is remarkably the earliest artwork we have that shows the conventions and standards for almost all Egyptian artwork to come. It displays the artistic canons, as we call them, that we commonly associate with Egyptian art. This palette has a new style and content compared with what came before. The palette helped to build the unwavering ideology of kingship for Egypt for the next 3,000 years. Let's take a closer look and see what's there. This is a 63 centimeter high and 42 centimeter wide piece of dense dark gray stone, siltstone, carved in low relief and polished. It has the shape of a shield. We know that it dates to somewhere around 3100 BC, a similar time frame to the Uruk vase from Mesopotamia. It was excavated at Hierakonpolis in a temple offering deposit. Both sides of this object are carved with different scenes. This shield-shaped palette is one of a series of similarly shaped objects that come from Egypt and from that site. They were formed in the shape of cosmetic palettes meant to grind eye makeup. You've probably already noticed the wonderful black cosmetic line around the eyes of the ancient Egyptians in their artworks. Let me show you how the Egyptians prepared and applied their eye cosmetics. This is a chunk of the lead ore called galena, and when I grind it, as they would have done, you can see it produces a very fine powder. It's a fairly soft stone, so it grinds very easily. Egyptians also ground other stones, such as the blue lapis lazuli or green malachite. I have a string of malachite beads here. Egyptians would have ground malachite for a green-colored eyeliner, but I'm not going to be grinding up my beads. This is a vial of commercially prepared coal, reflecting the fact that women do still use coal today. Here are two beautiful late 19th and early 20th century silver coal containers from the Middle East. Now you can see me applying coal to add emphasis to my eyes, just as many women do today. The eyeliner wasn't only a cosmetic meant to emphasize the eyes. Some scientists believe that it actually had medicinal properties. It protected the eyes from too much sun, from flies, infections, and supposedly even enhanced eye health by stimulating the immune system. Here, you have the device used to produce the eye makeup, except that this palette was not actually meant for the real task. No, this is a ritual palette. It's a really large palette that had religious importance. It may even have been meant to grind eye powder for images of the gods. The remarkable thing about it is that the artist packed such a wealth of detail into the scenes depicted on its surface. So, what is carved on it, and what's the general meaning? Essentially, it shows us a king who appears to be in battle on one side, smiting an enemy with his mace, and on the other side celebrating his victory. The king is identified as Narmer by the hieroglyphs at the top. On one side, he wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, and on the other, the red crown of Lower Egypt. The enemy appears to be a representative of a people from the north, where the lush papyrus marshes of the Nile Delta lay. What we think this palette is documenting is this: the beginning and the unification of the Egyptian state, perhaps by the conquest of the south over the north. Many scholars now think this shows a metaphorical battle for unity of North and South Egypt, while others, especially in the past, saw it more literally, as an actual act or series of battles. Whether metaphor or real, the visual symbolism and message set forth are important for Egypt as a state for the next 3,000 years. The state of Egypt is seen, even from this early, as a union of what is called the two lands, the Red Land and the Black Land, the North and the South, Upper and Lower Egypt. Remember that what we call Upper Egypt is actually in the south, and Lower Egypt is in the north, the delta of the Nile flowing into the Mediterranean Sea. This Egyptian worldview shows that duality was an important facet of Egyptian life, religion, and art. It's undoubtedly related to their geographic location, which was unique in the world. Unlike the south-flowing, meandering Mesopotamian rivers, which were unreliable, Egypt has the very reliable and straight Nile River flowing north from Sudan. The Nile floods at regular intervals, providing a layer of rich silt which made the land so productive to farm. But the black silt from the flooding only covered a thin strip along the banks of the Nile, so that was the only arable land. Desert lay beyond. It's striking how definite the demarcation is between red desert and green farmland or black silt. Another difference between Mesopotamia and Egypt is the steadiness of the sun, along with little or no rain. The sun is thus a major factor in Egyptian religion, reflecting that. Mesopotamia, on the other hand, had quite variable and less predictable weather and landscape. Hence, they had a preponderance of these storm and weather gods. On the most basic and simplest level, Egyptian society could and liked to make a clear demarcation between the domestic and the wild lands, order and chaos, native and foreign enemy, and the desert and fertile land. They really liked the clarity of dualities. With Egyptian society based on the predictability of nature, the Egyptians could also maintain one of the most stable traditions in art, religion, and culture ever known. This is quite contrary to the many different strains in Mesopotamia and the rest of the Near East. Additionally, people in Egypt could be easily united by the Nile spine and its north-south axis. Mesopotamia, on the other hand, was a crossroads of trade, cultures, and conflict from the very beginning of civilization until the present day. Scarce and unpredictable resources in a desert landscape provoked movement and fighting in both regions. So how did the king figure into the Egyptian worldview? He was seen as central. He was the uniter of the two lands. He was the bulwark against chaos, the hero who maintained order and interceded with the gods, holder of a divine office. He was a sort of junior god. He was associated with the falcon god Horus when he was alive, and with the underworld god Osiris after he died and became fully divine. And we can see some of those aspects of kingship represented right here on this early artwork. This palette dates to what we call the Naqada III period, or sometimes Dynasty 0, about 3100 BC. So this was made when kings were just beginning to establish a definite role, judging from the art and archaeology of the times. On the smiting side, we see that the field of the palette has been divided into 3 sections. The middle one forms the ground line for the largest figure of Narmer as king. He's unmistakably the most important person, taking up the most space. His height is exaggerated by the crown he wears. This is the bulbous white crown of Upper Egypt. It seems that Upper Egyptian culture did in fact prevail over Lower Egyptian groups in pre-dynastic times. That's what this scene is telling us. Directly above Narmer's crown is his name, written in hieroglyphs. These are some of the earliest hieroglyphs we know of. You can also see a little box with a pattern on the bottom. This represents the Serek, or palace enclosure, which contains the king's Horus name. This was the oldest name known to be given to Egyptian kings and was called that because of the image of Horus that was usually a part of it. The king was the living embodiment of the god Horus. Egyptian kings eventually added more titles or names, and ultimately there were 5. The name here consists of a catfish and a chisel, Narmer. The palace is shown both as a plan from above and as an elevation from the front. So this signifies that the king is in his palace and identifies him by Horus' name. He's at the top in what we are to interpret as the sky. His name is flanked by 2 frontally facing cow faces with long horns and ears that project to the sides. These represent the sky goddess. The line below it demarcates this region as the sky. This is the first instance of artwork showing the characteristic Egyptian use of registers to ground figures and to separate scenes. Let's look at Narmer himself. He has some stylistic attributes that become standard in Egyptian art. First of all, he's shown in a pose that becomes iconic for victory, smiting a kneeling, almost sprawling enemy. He grasps a lock of his hair with his left hand while raising the mace to strike him. We'll see this pose frequently, and not only in Egypt. Narmer wears not only a crown, but also a false beard, something associated with kingship from now on. He has on a kilt and an animal's tail. His figure is shown in what becomes the standard canon for Egyptian depictions of people, what Egyptian art is famous for. It's a composite view of different ones and what we most strikingly associate with Egyptian art. So, the face is shown in profile, but the eye is shown as if it were frontal. The shoulders are depicted by a frontal view, but below the waist, we have profile. It's hard to do. The feet at this time in history are both the same. The instep and big toe are shown. This represents how one should look. Egyptians were not interested in using perspective or foreshortening here, how things actually look to the eye. Note that Narmer's musculature is very well defined and his legs are rather long. He strides in the same kind of wide stance that we saw in the stela of Naram Sin. This is the stance of dominance and victory. It's instantly recognizable to all of us, and in fact, recent studies have shown that winning athletes also adopt this stance unconsciously. But who is the almost naked victim? With palms upraised in a gesture of defeat, he looks very different from the king. He has a full beard, large nose, and a thick wedge of hair cut off at the neck. 2 hieroglyphs to the right identify him and read wash, although we're not sure of more than the name. Above him is a sort of explanation of what is happening. A similar but not identical head seems to grow out of a land sign, a clump out of which 6 papyrus flowers sprout. This symbolizes the Delta people. And you can see that a Horus falcon is perched on the papyrus with one leg ending in a human arm and hand that grasps a rope connected to the enemy's nose. Clearly, the Horus falcon, signifying the king, is shown dominating these Delta peoples. The rope, of course, is an almost universal tool of subordination. It ties up prisoners. We saw it already in the Akkadian stela and with the Moche prisoners. So the message of domination is clear. But there's more. Behind the king is a smaller figure, and he's the royal sandal bearer. He wears an entirely different loincloth, and a rosette with another sign identifies him. He stands on his own ground line. Below the king, trampled under his feet, and in the bottom register of the palette are 2 defeated enemies. They're naked and in a pose that most likely signifies death. The fallen enemies are each associated with a sign. The one on the left looks like a crenellated or notched battlement. It could be a fort or town plan. The nakedness of the enemies shows their humiliation and defeat. We see this nakedness in many other places, along with a posture that conveys death or submission. the Naram Sin stela, Maya prisoners at Palenque, and elsewhere, like the captives in Moche and other Andean art. If we turn to the other side of the palette, we find 4 registers. The topmost consists of the same motifs as the other side, although the serif looks different. The second register shows us some of the same characters. We see the king, again the largest figure, but this time he's wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, a different kilt, carries a mace and a flail, and is preceded by his name in hieroglyphs. You can see the lovely catfish in his name more clearly. The same royal sandal bearer follows him. In front, his retinue consists of a long-haired person wearing some sort of animal skin, walking in a more natural manner. He's identified by 2 signs. Ahead is a group of 4 progressively smaller standard bearers. 2 hold aloft falcon emblems, and 1 carries a jackal, while the 4th we're not sure about. They're all slightly different in appearance, but notice this, they're shown completely in profile, unlike Narmer and his servants. What they confront is interesting. A group of 10 beheaded enemies whose bodies have been laid out with their heads between their legs. Each body is bound around the waist and arms, and the headgear of one of the detached enemy heads differs slightly from the others. Narmer is triumphantly inspecting the bodies, which are placed below some signs that may indicate a temple or a palace. A boat seems to hover above them. Are these dead men dead from the battle? Or are they war prisoners who have been ritually executed? Does this take place in or near a temple? Is this some sort of religious ritual? We can't be sure. If we move down to the most prominent register, we see something very unusual. 2 strange mythical beasts with long necks intertwined confront each other. They are being held back by leashes or ropes at the neck, pulled by 2 bearded men in loincloths who seem to float above the tails of the mythical beasts. We don't find this motif ever again in Egyptian art after this period. Now, this is getting really interesting. What we have here in the center is the round, saucer-like depression which would be used for grinding the pigment on a real palette. It's created by the design of the animals' necks. And what kind of animals are they? They look like lionesses with muscular bodies and upcurving tails. At least their heads certainly look like lionesses, the ears and the slightly snarling mouth. But of course the necks are fanciful. We see the same unusual motif in Mesopotamia at this time on an Uruk period cylinder seal. It's been suggested that this motif was borrowed from Mesopotamia, and it definitely implies exchange and contact between Egypt and areas to the east. This motif is an unusual and clever response to the problem of creating that circular space for grinding the pigment. It also has some metaphorical meaning. Some scholars interpret it as representing the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. In other words, the intertwining necks shows a peaceful union or pact. The nature of the scene, however, gives me pause concerning that interpretation. The confrontation looks a bit hostile to me. In fact, it seems much more like subjugation of a people. Here's why. The 2 men look very much like Nubians with the short curly hair, and they're actively and vigorously restraining the beast by pulling their ropes. Lionesses, after all, are known for their ferocity, since they're the ones who do most of the killing for the pride. They're associated with war. Additionally, most of the slate palettes known from this period show scenes of battle and hunting. Most famous is the battlefield palette, which shows a scene of carnage with defeated dead enemies scattered on the field. A lion bites into the stomach of an enemy and vultures circle. Some pluck out the eyes of the dead men. Nice. The other side of this palette, interestingly, depicts two gazelles. I identified them as long-necked gerenux, confronting a palm tree. This is an arrangement that's very characteristic of Mesopotamia. Another palette in the Louvre, the Four Dogs palette, shows a very similar scene of giraffes confronting a palm tree with four dogs around the periphery. On the other side, we see a lion and one of our long-necked feline creatures. And on yet another pre-dynastic Egyptian palette, called the Hierakonpolis palette, or Two Dogs palette, we see two of these mythical creatures seemingly attacking a bull. All these palettes seem to be covered with images of predators hunting prey and human battles and prisoners. My own interpretation of this creature is based on a little real-life experience with giraffes. In Nakuru, Kenya, we witnessed an impressive sight: two male giraffes necking, fighting for dominance. As they fight, they swing their heads, intertwining their necks while trying to knock each other out with their heavy heads. It was dramatic and beautiful to see gigantic creatures like these engaged in battle. It dawned on me that the image of this mythical creature might be based on this sort of combative behavior of the giraffes. While the device of confrontational animals is certainly a decoratively pleasing motif, it's also probably meaningful. This rare, aggressive giraffe behavior must have been known to the Nubians who handled them here and to the Egyptians as well. Egyptians were close observers of animals and cognizant of their behavior. Perhaps this mythical, long-necked, lioness-like beast is meant to combine the predatory nature of the lion with the combat necking of the male giraffes. In that case, it would represent battle more than union, but that's my own interpretation. Other scholars believe that the men wielding the ropes that subjugate these mythical animals represent the king's subjugation of the forces of chaos. It was the king's duty in Egypt to maintain order in the world. He had to defeat the forces of disorder. This is the ruler's chief raison d'etre, and battling enemies was his primary means of doing so. Performing religious rituals was another. Moving on to the bottommost register and last scene we'll discuss. We see a large bull, muscular and with large horns, lowering his head as if to strike or impale someone. He steps on the victim of his attack, evidently a dead enemy with long hair and naked. His bent back, pinwheel-like position marks him as dead, just like the enemies at the bottom of the other side. The bull horns seem to break open some sort of fortification. This type of niched pattern is a symbol of a wall of a fort or town. 3 bricks are falling below the horns. Defeat. The bull must symbolize the king and his strength. There's several parallels to this scene. Here you have the main scene on another palette, a bull, beautifully rendered as muscular and strong, goring a foreign enemy. He also tramples him. We see below them, attached to a rope, 5 standards for some of the nomes or regions of Egypt. The bull, like the lion, just as we saw in Mesopotamia, is associated with the strength and virility of the king. Later, in New Kingdom Egypt, the pharaohs were even called Mighty Bull or Bull of Horus. That reminds one of the greater emphasis on bulls in Mesopotamia and their similar association with kings. All in all, we've just seen the most beautiful example of a slate palette, indeed of any Egyptian art from this period. The carving is superb, the polishing and the structure of the composition, it's extremely clever and skilled. When you examine the palette, this strikes you. Just how much information and detail the artist managed to fit onto an awkwardly shaped, very hard stone. The story he tells is superbly presented, and it's really remarkable that we can still understand a great deal of it today, even if we aren't sure of the exact meaning of every symbol. The most significant aspect of this masterpiece is how brilliantly the theme of kingly power and domination is presented. Through hierarchy of scale, the king's position and his representation in metaphors, using animals and buildings, the power of the king is conveyed. The king wields military might. His enemies are struck down, decapitated, gored, roped, and trampled. His sphere of authority is demonstrated by his two crowns that imply the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. He creates order out of chaos. So this masterwork of relief sculpture not only documents an actual king's power and possibly some real battles, but something more. It sets the tone and the canons for the representation of the Egyptian king. These conventions are so effective here that they don't change substantially for 3,000 years. Not many cultures can say that one work of art represents anything like that. The greatest artists of Egypt worked for the kings, and they created some of the most iconic and powerful pieces the world has known. The palette here foreshadows the path and trajectory of Egyptian art to come. Next, we will see what happens when these ideas, skills, and artistic canons are applied to a king from the age of the pyramids. We'll see how the king continued to use visual symbols to communicate his power. We'll also see how the Egyptians dealt with death, which was a consuming obsession of the culture. We'll be looking at the great tomb sculpture of the Egyptian king Khafre, or Khephren. This is a massive and powerful masterpiece that was meant to last for eternity.